Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be jumping into the competitive scene and we're going to be analyzing a couple of the recent GT winning lists that went undefeated in the past couple of weeks. One of which, in late September, went undefeated in the GT using Shadow Weavers, a unit that, quite frankly, a lot of us have written off in competitive play. However, this player was a Giga Chad and was actually able to use them effectively and have them synergize very well with the rest of his list. Now, even though I usually don't cover super competitive play, lately since the beginning of the edition, I have been very averse to covering Eldar tournament success just because of the fact that, well, it was very one-sided. With the exception of a few different matchups, the Eldar were pretty much dominating every single tournament. And all the lists pretty much looked exactly the same, so I really didn't want to kind of go into it too much, but now that the Eldar have been brought down a little bit, we're seeing much more diversity, and I would be more than happy to dive in and share with you guys the different strategies and synergies that exist within those lists and how those players are actually able to bring such a strong list into their games. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right in to today's video. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the details of the two tournaments. We have two tournament lists that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to be reviewing and, of course, doing an analysis of those two undefeated lists. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what this means for the Eldar in competitive play now and, of course, moving forward. But before I do any of that, I do have to give a special thanks to both the YouTube channel Den of Fools and, of course, the website Goonhammer for providing the data for these events. These two sources have always been a good source of tournament data, so thank you to them for continuously providing that for the community. All right, so let's dive right into the first tournament we're going to be covering today. This is going to be the GT Bunker Hammer in Vitoria-Gasteiz, Spain. It was on the 23rd and 24th of September, so last month after the Balance Data slate, of course, so after all the nerfs and stuff, but, 3-4 weeks ago now. It had 204 players, and there were about 1,200 games played at this event, so pretty massive event. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the list that won second place at this event. So just keep in mind, this is an event with 206 players, and this player went undefeated. So yes, they didn't score first place, but second place is still a massive victory, especially considering that he brought such weird units. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So the person who brought this list was Fernando Martinez. He brought a Farseer with a Phoenix Gem and Witchblade, which is pretty common, right? You always see that in pretty much every list, the Farseer Skyrunner. And that's basically just to make sure that your Warwalkers and so forth can get those extra damaging Brightland shots off. Whenever you are running Warwalkers in your list, you want to make sure that you are continuously able to make those Bright Lances damage 8, which is very significant because a lot of breakpoints on vehicles are at, 16 wounds, or sometimes even at 13 wounds where, the other Bright Lance would have a better chance killing it if you were able to use that 6 on a Fate dice. So, of course, very powerful combination, but a lot of us already know that. He also has an Autarch Wayleaper, which is, again, a common pick, right? So far, it's looking pretty standard. Get that extra command point to use on things like Phantasm, Fire and Fade, and stuff like that. He has a Solitaire in his list, which is a little bit of a rare choice. We have seen the Solitaire in some competitive lists before here and there, and the Solitaire is just a great piece, especially after the nerfs. He specifically did not get touched with the nerfs. And the Solitaire is not only great at killing stuff, but also great at scoring secondary objectives with the Blitz ability. So if you need to get to a certain area of the board, you roll that 2d6, you add it to your already high movement of 12, and you can pretty much get anywhere you want on the board to score objectives. So very good tool to have in your toolbox that allows you a lot of flexibility and will frustrate your opponent to no end. So unlike the Death Jester is very strong, but not included in this list because, of course, I think what Fernando was thinking about with the Solitaire was having that flexibility to either kill something very tough or force objective points that, his opponent really couldn't do anything about. because A, the Solitaire is very easy to hide. So even if you are within 12 with ruins and stuff like that, you can easily hide and basically become untargetable through line of sight. Or you just have Lone Operative and can't be shot at. So even if those things are gotten past, you could use Phantasm, right? Phantasm is a way for you to just back off, reestablish Lone Operative, and frustrate your opponent. So the Solitaire is a great pick for this list. Something you don't see often, because I think it does require a large amount of skill to use. The Solitaire is very much like the Yin-Karn, but I would even say a little bit more tricky. Now, the Spirit Seer is going to have Fate's Messenger. So the Spirit Seer is going to be attached to a blob of 10 Wraithguard. This is a very common pick. You know, you have a Spirit Seer with Fate's Messenger and 10 Wraithguard. We will go into the strategies behind that unit in just a second. But basically, the Spirit Seer gives them +1 to hit and revives models every turn. Well, during your turn, not during both turns like it used to be able to do. All right, so as for the other data sheets in his list, he has 2 Hornets with Bright Lances. These are his anti-large tech. Now, what he decided to do with his list is instead of go with the Fire Prisms, which is a common choice, he decided to go wider with the Hornets. So the 2 Hornets are only 200 points total, and they're quite a bit more expendable than a Fire Prism. So you can move one of them out, shoot it at target down range, use the Farseer, Branching Fates combination to do a bunch of damage. Then you have a choice. You can burn the CP for Fire and Fade, or because they're kind of more expendable, you can just leave them out there and force your opponent to deal with them. And of course, he has 2 of these, so they can also deal a good amount of mortal wound damage to targets they move over. So typically, yeah, you're not going to be moving them into the center of the board or anything, but in the late game, when your opponent doesn't have a lot left, they can certainly come out, deal some mortal wounds, eliminate that last model or those last couple models on an objective, and score you some major points at the end of the game. So Hornets definitely have the flexibility to either stay back and shoot with their Bright Lances, with the Farseer, of course, which is the common tactic, or in the late game, deal some mortal wound damage to enemy infantry and other targets. He has a Night Spinner, of course, which is a staple of pretty much every Eldar list nowadays. I don't think I've seen a single list without at least one of these in it, but, could be wrong, but I think most of them do have a Night Spinner for that board control aspect. Eldar are a board control style army, and they do often need units that can kind of do something like this. We had it last edition with D-Cannon batteries, and we have it this edition with the Night Spinner. He has 5 Shadow Specters. Shadow Specters are a common pick as well. They're very good against heavy infantry, and they're also decent against hordes. So a unit of those is always good. They also move 6 inches, so they have a lot of flexibility in the objective game after they shoot. And I'm not necessarily talking about secondary objectives, although they can achieve these. I'm mostly referring to primary objectives. If they want to go into deep strike, start the game in deep strike instead of on the board, maybe your opponent has a lot of, indirect fire or things that can really easily kill them. They can start in deep strike, they can deep strike down on the board, and then they can move 6 inches afterward. So they can get onto objectives your opponent didn't expect and stuff like that. He also has 5 Swooping Hawks, which are very good at secondary objective scoring. And it basically is a unit that puts a lot of mental pressure on your opponent. So opponents can't rely on things like sticky objectives or, kind of defending their objectives with very weak units, because Swooping Hawks can basically just go back in reserve, come out, shoot them, kill them, and then get on the objective. And this is really a theme that we've seen throughout this list so far, being able to control your opponent by presenting them with multiple different threats that they can't really deal with effectively. Things like Swooping Hawks, the Night Spinner, of course, and the Solitaire. As for the other data sheets, we see, probably for the first time in a long time, 2 support weapons with Shadow Weavers. So this is the real question, right? Why are there Shadow Weavers in this list? Doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? They cost more points than an additional Night Spinner, and they don't really offer that much more. Well, in this particular list, they actually do offer something that the Night Spinner does not. And that is a very easy way to apply -1 to hit to enemy units that might threaten your army, especially things like Wraithguard, things that you need to be able to control the center of the board with. So having a permanent -1 to hit on potentially 2 units in your enemy army at all times is a very useful thing to have to make it harder for your opponent to actually reliably do damage to tough units. However, this is not the only function they serve. right? Because if this was the only function they serve, I think it would be a little bit dubious as to whether or not to include 2 of them in your army. But 2 of them actually offers a very similar amount of damage, if not a little bit more, than a Night Spinner, especially against targets with damage 1, well, essentially 1 wound, right? Because the Shadow Weaver has damage 1. And it also has the blast keyword, so it's really efficient into units of 10 models with a single wound. And because it also has a high strength, right, it can easily fire into things like Imperial Guardsmen, wounding them on a 2+, or Cultists, wounding them on a 2+, or even Leagues of Votann, wounding them on a 3+, right? Leagues of Votann, Hearthkin Warriors, or something like that. So the Shadow Weaver actually has a lot of versatility in the units it can target on the battlefield. A Night Spinner will simply not be that efficient against a unit of 10 Cultists, but 2 Shadow Weavers are extremely efficient. And just check this out for a second. This is something I didn't even really consider or think about. But if you have 2 of these support weapon Shadow Weavers, right, with D6 attacks each, shooting at a unit of 10 Cultists in the back, each one of them is getting D6 plus 2 shots. So in 2 turns, you can clear an objective of Cultists or other light infantry with these 2 support weapons. You can also use them in conjunction with Swooping Hawks to clear an objective in 1 turn and allow these Swooping Hawks to move onto that objective with things like Phantasm or, of course, Fire and Fade. Once again, putting a ton of pressure on your opponent to be able to deal with all these different threats and possible combinations that you're going to be throwing out at them. This list just drips with synergy. It also has 5 Warp Spiders. Now, the 5 Warp Spider inclusion, just because Warp Spiders are a pretty good piece to have on the battlefield, right? You can hide them very easily. They move 24 inches. If you position them correctly, they're going to get a really powerful overwatch against any unit winding up on an objective. There's a lot of reasons why you'd want 5 Warp Spiders in your list. So they're a very good unit. You have your 10 Wraith Guard with Wraith Cannons, again, with the Spirit Seer to control the middle of the board. And just provide some really very powerful anti-large damage to the middle of the board that your opponent is going to need to deal with. They can't just ignore it. And you have 3 Warwalkers with Bright Lances. So again, the decision not to go with the Fire Prisms and go wider with Warwalkers and Hornets is actually a very smart move because it allows Fernando to basically bank some command points and use them somewhere else on the battlefield where they might be needed, right? If you had 2 Fire Prisms in this list, you wouldn't be able to do cool stuff with the Swooping Hawks, like Fire and Fade onto an objective after you come in from Skyleap. Or use Phantasm on your Solitaire when enemies are getting close to them. And when the September data slate hit in the beginning of September, I knew that more players were going to be foregoing Fire Prisms and instead going a little bit wider. Now, some players do still use Fire Prisms. I think Fire Prisms are still great, obviously, but going wider with Hornets, Warwalkers, Vipers, things like that is a viable tactic as well. So yeah, I think this list has a ton of synergy in it. I really like what it's going for. Obviously has a lot of hitting power while still being able to control objectives and things like that. Not a lot of lists out there can do that. So congratulations to Fernando Martinez for your insane undefeated run in the tournament. Congrats, man. It's really an awesome thing to see somebody running a list like this with 2 Shadow Weavers and finding success with it. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the next tournament list that I'm going to cover. This was at the 2023 Michigan GT 40K Championship in Lansing, Michigan on October 7th. And this had 126 players for a total of about 630 games played over 5 rounds. So without further ado, let us go ahead and take a look at the first place list and give it a proper review and analysis. So this list was ran by Brenton Weiss. The characters, of course, he had the double avatars, the Avatar of Cain and the Yinkarn. It's funny because a member of my channel Discord actually did the same exact thing, ran the double avatars in a tournament a while back and had a sweeping victory 3-0 on an an RTT. So I think that's a very viable way to play an Eldar list, is with 2 very tough characters like that. Of course, he has a Farseer for the Fortune in the back, and it looks like that's all he really cares about with the Farseer because doesn't have a Phoenix Gem. So either he's banking that his opponents aren't going to have a lot of indirect fire, or he's just basically saying, you know what, I don't care if the Farseer dies. Once he casts Fortune on the Avatar turn 1, that's all I really care about. So that may also be the case. He has an Autarch Wayleaper, of course, like always. And yeah, just to generate command points and sit on a home objective. And that's basically it. As for his other data sheets, he has double Fire Prism. So one of the things you've been seeing more and more is people shying away from the triple prism and going to double prism. This is because prisms have gotten so expensive that more people are a little bit more wary of actually going triple prism. And he also has, really expensive models in his army like the Avatar of Cain and the Yinkarn, so he has to make room for that. He has a Night Spinner, of course, and that's that control element that pretty much every Eldar army has nowadays. And guys, between you and me, I think the Night Spinner might actually get nerfed in December. We might actually see a nerf coming up in the next balanced data slate for the Night Spinner. Whether its ability gets nerfed or its points get nerfed again, I don't know. But we will probably see a nerf because Night Spinners are basically in every single list. If it's not a single Night Spinner, it's a double Night Spinner. And I've even seen some lists with triple Night Spinner. So I think Night Spinners are next on the chopping block. But yeah, essentially the Night Spinner is key to controlling the board and making, units even slower and not basically able to function properly. You have 5 Shadow Specters, which again are great mech, kind of Terminator equivalent killers. They're also good at dealing with hordes of infantry. This list also is kind of unique because it has 2 units of Swooping Hawks. Now, the thing about the Swooping Hawks is, I've always said from the beginning, they're a solid unit. They're not like they were last edition where they were very uninteractable, but they're solid at secondary objective scoring. So what Brenton decided to do was, instead of run the double Spectre, decided to just go with 1 Spectre and go double Swooping Hawk. Swooping Hawks are a bit cheaper than the Shadow Spectres, and while they don't have the hard-hitting anti-Terminator punch that the Shadow Spectres do, they more than make up for the light infantry damage, and they're just better at scoring on secondary objectives in general. You have 2 Warwalkers in this list, of course, with Bright Lances. They're a classic, they're great trading pieces, and they can trade up against most big, large targets. And then you have 5 Warp Spiders, again, for the objective play and board control aspect. And again, Warp Spiders are pretty good at controlling certain areas of the board from certain units because they have torrent weapons that deal devastating wounds. So on average, getting about 3 or so devastating wounds on a target may be enough to kill it and may dissuade an opponent from moving something into their range. And of course, if these opportunities to, control the board don't present themselves, Warp Spiders can always just move 24 inches, score on secondary objectives, and stuff like that. They're a very versatile and solid unit, even at 115 points. So I like this list a lot. I think it really revolves mostly around secondary objective play and putting pressure on his opponent with the Yinkarn. The Yinkarn, of course, is a very powerful tool. And when you combine that with an Avatar who is controlling the center of the battlefield, you have a recipe for success in any competitive event. And I think the unique part about this list and the very, kind of clever part about this list is the inclusion of the 2 Swooping Hawks. 2 Swooping Hawk units are very good on objective play, but also they can get to areas of the battlefield that your opponent is going to have a lot of trouble dealing with if they actually do end up killing the Swooping Hawks. Because guess what? You have the Yinkarn, who can just appear out of the Swooping Hawks and then basically dominate that area of the board under the right circumstances. So not only does your opponent have to worry about the Swooping Hawks stealing objectives or, eliminating isolated targets, but they also have to worry about the possibility of, if they do kill the Swooping Hawks, they have to now deal with the Yinkarn, which the Yinkarn is a very powerful model, very hard to kill, halves all damage, does extreme amounts of melee damage, and of course, damage at range as well to infantry. So it is something that is very powerful and pretty much impossible to ignore. So overall, even though you have the staples of the list, you have the Autarch Wayleaper, you have the common double Fire Prism, you have the Night Spinner in the list, you have the Warwalkers in the list, you have all those, core aspects. You do have the unique double Avatar and Swooping Hawks to back up the Yinkarn and basically be able to place the Yinkarn exactly where you need it to be. And if your opponent doesn't shoot the Swooping Hawks, well, the Swooping Hawks have a lot of fun wrecking your backline and stealing your objectives. So yeah, definitely well played to Brenton Weiss. Congrats on taking first place in the tournament. So Now that we've reviewed those 2 tournament winning lists over the past month, what does this mean for the Eldar and competitive play now and moving forward? So a couple weeks ago when the September data slate hit, I did a video talking about what I thought it meant for the Eldar moving forward. And one of the first things I said was that Eldar players were going to have to start rethinking their lists without the Wraith Knight, right? And they're going to have to start being more broad. They're going to have to start taking more units for objectives and stuff like that. So what we can definitely see now is that Eldar players are using a more broad set of units, and they are still being successful in a competitive setting, even with units not considered meta if used synergistically. So Shadow Weavers and Swooping Hawks were nowhere near meta before the September balanced data slate. Now we're seeing them in lists, and we're seeing them synergize with other aspects of the army, which is really cool to see. And we're also seeing, of course, that clever players with unique list ideas can perform well if they know what they're doing. So using 2 Shadow Weavers, for example, your average Eldar player maybe just started playing or maybe just doesn't play competitively might look at Shadow Weavers and say, those things can never be used in any list. They're terrible for their points. But somebody who actually, kind of has a plan for them and uses them properly can actually find a place for them, which I found extremely impressive. So for all you Eldar players out there who think that there is a meta and that you can't really go outside of that unless you want to be a casual, you might start wanting to rethink a few units you once considered trash, because there's a lot of units out there that strictly just aren't. And if you use them correctly, they're going to do very well for you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but maybe in a week or so we'll see some Storm Guardians in a competitive list. Who knows? I know that Fire Dragons are making their way into a lot of competitive lists, so you guys, some of you didn't believe me on that. You said, no, Proxy Hammer, Fire Dragons, I want them to be good, but they're trash, man. They're not good. They're too sacrificial. They're going to die right after you use them, and they're just not good enough to use in competitive play. Well, they're starting to be used in competitive play because they're actually really good for the points cost. You just need to know how to use them. You need to know how exactly to place them on the battlefield for them to be effective. And if you haven't played with them, they can be kind of awkward to use if you're not familiar with them. But for somebody like me or another Eldar player who's been playing with Fire Dragons for many, many years, we will tell you that Fire Dragons are not a terrible unit. They're actually a very good unit for their cost now. They're not too expensive like they were before, and they perform their role perfectly. Again, for their points. And I am really glad to see Fire Dragons being played more and more. They're one of my favorite units, so it's good to see that. And it's good to see these other, kind of units like Swooping Hawks and Shadow Weavers that aren't really used much see more competitive play going forward. All right, everybody. So in conclusion, Eldar have always been an army about synergies, and it's good to see successful lists diving deep into that post-September data slate, right? Going back to all of the synergies that make Eldar so great. To be successful with Eldar in competitive play, knowing how your units can play off each other and interact with enemy units and armies is key to competitive success. So those Shadow Weavers, normally on paper, they don't look that good, but when you start to look at what they can do with other units in your army, they start to look a whole lot better. So synergy is key for all you Eldar players looking to get into competitive play. You have to start thinking about the synergies in your army and what you can do on each and every turn and how your units support each other. But not only that, the matchups that are involved and the tools that you need to bring in your list to deal with those hard matchups. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help has been greatly appreciated, and it has officially been a year now that the channel has been fully operational. So thank you once again for all your support. If you do want to support the channel, you can become a Patreon member. I have free trials for Patreon activated, so you can become one for absolutely free. And this free trial grants you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who like talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I'll go ahead and leave the link for that in the description. I also have a channel store page and am an Amazon affiliate, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store, or buy some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave those links in the description as well. And lastly, for those of you who do not know, I am currently working on an Eldar Knights fan deck, so if you want to support that, I have a Kickstarter going for that. I will also leave that link in the description, and I also have a video on my channel covering it. So definitely check out that video if you are interested in that kind of thing and you potentially want a free copy of the fan decks once it's completed. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Peace out. Have some great games this weekend, and I'll see you guys next time. By the way, before I go, just want to mention I did see those striking scorpions out of the kill team, and they're looking great. So we're going to be talking about that soon. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.